Margaret Whitmore shuffled across the cracked asphalt of Pine Valley Regional Airport, her worn leather flight bag slung over one shoulder. At 73, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to rush, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun that wisps of morning wind tried to undo. The faded wool sweater she wore despite the warm Colorado morning was threadbare at the elbows, and her khaki pants bore a small tear near the left knee that she'd been meaning to mend for months. The few people who noticed her that Tuesday morning saw exactly what they expected. Another elderly pilot clinging to independence, probably flying to visit grandchildren or attend a doctor's appointment. They couldn't have been more wrong. Her destination was a rust-stained Cessna 172 that had seen better decades. The 1965 aircraft showed its age in every rivet, every streak of oxidation marking the aluminum skin. The pale blue paint had faded to something closer to gray, and the registration numbers N847MG on the tail were barely legible. But Margaret ran her weathered hand along the fuselage with genuine affection, the way someone might touch an old friend's shoulder. "Still holding together, aren't we, girl?" she murmured, beginning her pre-flight inspection. To anyone watching, and few were, her movements around the aircraft seemed routine, but there was something almost ritualistic about the way she checked. Each control surface tested the fuel, examined the tires. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, moved with practiced efficiency that spoke of muscle memory so deep it transcended physical limitation. Inside the cockpit, Margaret settled into the worn pilot's seat with a small sigh. The interior smelled of old leather and aviation fuel, scents that brought the ghost of a smile to her weathered face. She reached into her flight bag and pulled out a small photograph, edges soft from handling, showing a bright-eyed girl of about 8 with dark hair and an infectious grin. With practiced movements, she taped the photo to the dashboard, positioning it just so. "Almost there, sweetheart," she whispered, though whether to the photo or herself wasn't entirely clear. The radio crackled to life as she began her startup sequence. "Cessna 847 Mike Golf, Pine Valley Tower, you're cleared for engine start." The controller sounded bored. Just another routine morning at a sleepy regional airport where the most excitement usually came from student pilots practicing touch-and-go landings. "Pine Valley Tower, 847 Mike Golf, Roger," Margaret acknowledged, her voice carrying none of the tremor one might expect from someone her age. It was crisp, professional, with an undertone of authority that seemed oddly out of place. As the old Continental engine coughed to life and settled into its familiar rhythm, Margaret noticed her transponder flickering. The ancient unit, probably original to the aircraft, had been temperamental lately. She tapped it once with her knuckle, a gesture both futile and habitual, then shrugged. It would either work or it wouldn't. 20 minutes later, she was airborne, climbing slowly into the morning sky. The Colorado landscape spread below her in a patchwork of farms and forests, the early sun casting long shadows across the valleys. She flew with the windows cracked open, letting the cool air wash over her face, following what appeared to be a route she'd flown dozens of times before, but appearances can be deceiving. In reality, Margaret Whitmore was following a flight path that had been burned into her memory 47 years ago, a path that no civilian pilot should have known existed, threading through airspace that hadn't been active since the Cold War. Her weathered hands remained steady on the yoke as she made minute corrections, adjustments that seemed random but were actually precise navigation fixes to waypoints that existed only in her memory. The first sign of trouble came exactly where she expected it. As she crossed into the restricted airspace surrounding Cheyenne Mountain, her transponder gave one last flicker and died completely. She glanced at it, then at her watch, and nodded almost imperceptibly. Right on schedule. Her weathered hands remained steady on the controls as she continued on course, making no attempt to fix the failed equipment or change direction. To any observer, it would have looked like confusion, like an elderly pilot who hadn't noticed she'd strayed into forbidden territory. But there was something about the way she held her heading, the way her eyes scanned the horizon with systematic precision, that suggested otherwise. In the darkened control room at Peterson Air Force Base, Staff Sergeant Rebecca Torres leaned, forward, frowning at her screen. "Sir, we've got an unidentified aircraft entering restricted airspace. No transponder signal, not responding to initial contact." Her supervisor, a tired-looking man named Tom Morrison, ambled over with coffee in hand. "Probably another student pilot who can't read a chart," he said with practiced indifference. "What's the aircraft type?" Torres squinted at the radar return. "Looks like a small single engine, moving about 90 knots. Profile suggests a Cessna, or similar civilian aircraft." Morrison sighed. "Send up the alert fighters. Follow standard intercept protocol. Probably just scare some weekend warrior who thought they'd take a shortcut home." Neither of them paid attention to the faint trajectory analysis in the corner of Torres's screen, the one that showed the aircraft following a very specific path through the mountains, threading between radar shadows with uncanny precision. They were too focused on following procedure to notice that this lost elderly pilot was flying a route that hadn't been active since the height of the Cold War. The F-16s launched 8 minutes later, twin arrows of destruction climbing into the morning sky. Captain Jake Morrison led the flight with Lieutenant Ashley Cooper on his wing. Both were young, ambitious, and thoroughly convinced of their own superiority. Morrison especially had developed a reputation for aggressive intercepts, taking particular pleasure in scaring civilian pilots who wandered where they shouldn't. "Viper 2, Viper 1, Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "I've got visual on the target." "Jesus, look at that thing. It's older than my grandfather's pickup truck." Cooper laughed through the radio static. "Roger that, Viper 1. Looks like someone raided a museum. You think they even have a working radio in that rust bucket?" They swept past Margaret's Cessna at 400 knots, the wake turbulence sending the small aircraft bucking like a boat in a storm. Through it all, Margaret's hands remained steady, making small corrections with the ease of someone who had experienced far worse turbulence under far more dangerous circumstances. She keyed her microphone, speaking in that same clear, calm voice that had puzzled the tower controller. "Viper Flight, this is 847 Mike Golf. I see you boys are having fun this morning." There was something in her tone, a hint of amusement, maybe even condescension, that immediately set Morrison's teeth on edge. "Unidentified aircraft," he replied, his voice dripping with practiced authority. "You are in restricted airspace. Turn south immediately and follow us to Peterson for landing. This is your only warning." Margaret glanced at the photograph on her dashboard, then at her watch. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Viper 1, unable to comply. I'm experiencing equipment issues and need to maintain current heading for navigation." Her voice carried an odd quality, a certain formal precision that seemed at odds with her appearance as a confused, elderly woman. Morrison's temper flared. "Listen, lady, I don't care what issues you think you have. You turn that flying antique around right now, or we'll turn it around for you." In the background, Cooper added with obvious mockery, "Maybe we should call the senior center, Jake. She sounds confused." But Margaret wasn't confused. As she looked out at the two fighters boxing her in, she allowed herself that same ghost of a smile. The script was playing out exactly as she'd hoped it would. Her fingers found the small scar on her right hand, tracing the V-shaped mark absently. Somewhere in her flight bag, carefully hidden beneath outdated charts and a half-eaten granola bar, lay a set of documents that would change everything. Documents that could only be delivered by someone who knew the old routes, someone who could fly them by memory and instinct rather than GPS and modern navigation, someone exactly like her. The morning sun glinted off the fighters' canopies as they maneuvered around her ancient Cessna, their pilots completely unaware that they were escorting not a confused senior citizen, but something far more dangerous. A ghost from America's most classified past returning from the shadows to complete one final mission. In 37 minutes, every person who had dismissed her as a harmless old woman would be standing at attention, faces pale with the realization of exactly who they'd been dealing with. But first, she had to let them believe they were in control. "Viper 1, Margaret's voice came through the radio with that same unnerving calm. "I am declaring an emergency. Primary navigation failure, possible medical issue with pilot. Request priority handling to nearest suitable field." It was textbook phraseology, delivered with a precision that seemed incongruous with the image of a confused elderly woman. Captain. Jake Morrison hesitated for just a moment. There was something about the way she'd said it, something that tickled at the back of his mind like a half-remembered song. But then he looked at the ancient Cessna puttering along at barely 90 knots, saw the rust stains and faded paint, and his contempt returned in full force. "Copy your emergency," he replied, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "Follow us to Peterson. Medical will be standing by." He switched to his tactical frequency. "Tower Viper 1, we're bringing in the Violator. Have security. And medical meet us on the ramp. Pilot claims medical emergency, but sounds like BS to me." Morrison's voice came back tinged with bureaucratic irritation. "Copy, Viper 1. What's your read on the situation?" Morrison laughed, the sound harsh through the radio static. "Just some old lady who probably forgot what year it is. Flew straight into restricted airspace like she owned the place. We'll have her on the ground in 15. Neither pilot noticed the way Margaret had subtly adjusted her course during the conversation, hadn't seen how she'd used their own wake turbulence to mask a slight deviation that would bring her directly over a very specific set of coordinates. They were too busy making jokes about dentures and bingo nights to realize they were escorting someone who had once been cleared to fly aircraft that officially didn't exist through airspace that was officially empty, but someone else had noticed. In the Peterson control tower, Miguel Santos, a senior controller with 30 years of experience, frowned at his screen. Something about the intercept track wasn't right. The flight path data showed patterns that tickled at old memories, stories. His father had told him about the Cold War days, about aircraft that flew routes that didn't exist on any chart. Miguel's father had been Air Force too, back when the mountain installations were being built, when strange aircraft came and went in the night without leaving any record of their passage. The old man had taken those stories to his grave, along with the sworn oath that had kept him silent for decades. Now, watching the radar track of this supposed confused civilian, Miguel felt the same chill his father must have felt all those years ago. The descent to Peterson was a masterclass in subtle defiance disguised as compliance. Margaret followed the fighter's lead, but always with just enough deviation to force them to constantly adjust their position. To the young pilots, it looked like the fumbling of an overwhelmed amateur. In reality, she was testing their reactions, cataloging their weaknesses, filing away information with the same systematic approach she'd once used to memorize the radar. Signatures of hostile installations half a world away. As the runway came into view, she could see the welcoming committee forming. Security vehicles lined the taxiway, their lights flashing in ominous synchronization. Fire trucks and an ambulance waited near the approach end, ready for whatever emergency she'd claimed. It was quite the production for one old woman in a dying Cessna. Margaret smiled again, that same slight upturn of weathered lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. They had no idea what was coming. No idea that in approximately 34 minutes every single person on that tarmac would be standing at attention, faces pale with the realization of what they'd done. The landing was perfect. Not good, not adequate, but perfect. The kind of landing that spoke of thousands of hours in dozens of aircraft types, of skills honed in conditions these young pilots couldn't imagine. The Cessna's wheels kissed the runway with barely a chirp, settling onto the center line as if guided by rails. Even through their contempt, both Morrison and Cooper noticed. That wasn't the landing of a confused amateur. That was the landing of someone who had touched down on shorter runways in worse conditions with far more at stake than a simple airspace violation. As she rolled toward the waiting security cordon, Margaret reached for the photograph on her dashboard, carefully, peeling it free and tucking it into her shirt pocket. Her other hand went to her flight bag, checking that the hidden documents were still secure. Through the scratched plexiglass of her side window, she could see the assembled crowd. TSA agents trying to look important, ground crew gathering for the show, and there, standing with barely concealed glee, Agent Dmitry Volkov of the Federal Protective Service. She'd read his file, knew his type. The kind of man who found validation in other people's humiliation, who used his badge as a license for cruelty. He would be the worst of them, she knew, and that would make what came next all the sweeter. The engine died with a final cough, propeller windmilling to a stop. In the sudden silence, Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, steady and strong despite her 73 years. She removed her headset with deliberate care, placing it on the glare shield just so. Through the radio chatter bleeding from the fighter's loudspeakers, she heard Morrison's voice dripping with satisfaction. "Tower, suspect aircraft is shut down. Moving in for apprehension." Suspect. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret Whitmore, suspected of the crime of being old, of being female, of being in a place they thought she didn't belong. The crowd was growing by the second. Someone had started a live stream. She could see phones held high, could imagine the captions already forming. Grandma goes rogue, elderly woman arrested after F-16 chase. They thought they were documenting a moment of comedy, a story to share over beers and laugh about. None of them realized they were about to become part of a very different story, one where the punchline would leave them choking on their own. Arrogance. The canopy opened with a groan of protest, and Margaret Whitmore emerged slowly, deliberately, each movement calculated to appear frail while maintaining complete control. Agent Dmitry Volkov was already charging forward, his face twisted with anticipation. "Step away from the aircraft! Hands where I can see them!" His voice boomed across the tarmac, unnecessarily loud, playing to the growing crowd of onlookers. Margaret complied with measured grace, her weathered hands rising slowly, palms open. The morning sun caught the faint scar on her right hand, that V-shaped mark that had once meant something very different to a very different world. "On your knees now!" Volkov barked, one hand on his sidearm, the other gesturing dramatically. Behind him, TSA agent Jessica Okafor snickered, already composing her social media post. "Somebody's grandma thinks she's Amelia Earhart," she muttered. To her colleague, Brandon Kowalski, who had his phone out, streaming live to his modest following. The comments were already flowing in, a cascade of laughing emojis and cruel observations about age and confusion. Margaret lowered herself carefully to the tarmac, her knees protesting against the hard surface. The familiar bite of concrete against aging joints brought back memories of other runways, other times when she'd been forced to kneel, but those had been enemy airfields behind enemy lines, with stakes far higher than the bruised ego of a power-drunk federal agent. As Volkov approached with the handcuffs, she caught a glimpse of movement near the control tower. A figure watching through binoculars, posture rigid with attention. Someone had noticed something. Good. The timeline was holding. The cuffs clicked shut with unnecessary force, metal biting into thin skin, drawing blood that seeped slowly into the cuffs of her worn sweater. Volkov grabbed her arm, hauling her upright with enough violence to tear the shoulder seam of her jacket. "You think you're special, old woman? You think rules don't apply to you?" He leaned close, breath hot with stale coffee and prejudice. "You're about to learn what happens when you mess with federal airspace." Captain Jake Morrison had climbed down from his F-16, striding cocky toward the scene. His flight suit was crisp, patches prominent, every inch the modern warrior. "Nice flying, Grandma," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Where'd you learn that? Microsoft Flight Simulator?" The crowd laughed, phones capturing every moment of humiliation. Lieutenant Ashley Cooper joined him, removing her helmet with theatrical flourish. "Should we call her family? Let them know Nana's been playing Top Gun?" Through it all, Margaret remained silent, her pale blue eyes fixed on some distant point, but those watching closely, and few were, might have noticed the way she shifted her weight, the way her breathing remained controlled despite the stress position Volkov had forced her into. In the control tower, Miguel Santos had pulled out, his personal phone, fingers flying across the screen as he sent a message to someone he hadn't contacted in 15 years. His father's old squadron buddy, now retired but still connected, still aware of things that officially didn't exist. "The vow?" Reply came back in seconds. "Confirm aircraft tail number immediately. Do not let them process her. Calling Washington now." Miguel's hands shook as he reached for the emergency phone, the red one that connected directly to base command. The trap was closing, but not around Margaret Whitmore. It was closing around everyone who had underestimated the quiet woman with blood on her wrists and steel in her spine. "Get her to processing," Agent Volkov ordered, shoving Margaret toward a waiting security van. She stumbled, caught herself, and in that moment of recovery, whispered something that made Brandon Kowalski's live stream viewers pause their mockery. The words were soft, almost inaudible, but his phone's microphone picked them up. Phoenix rises from ashes of contempt. In the comment stream, someone typed, "Did she just say Phoenix? What's that about?" But the moment passed, buried under a flood of memes and mockery. The viewers had no idea they'd just heard the first hint of a revelation that would shatter everything they thought they knew about the woman being dragged across the tarmac. The processing area was a converted hangar, fluorescent lights harsh against gray walls. They photographed her like a common criminal, fingerprinted her with ink that stained her weathered hands black. Through it all, she maintained that same, distant calm, responding to questions with minimal words. "Name?" demanded Agent Volkov, enjoying his moment of power. "Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore." "Age?" 73. "Purpose of flight?" "Personal matter." Each answer was delivered in that same precise tone that seemed to irritate her captors even more than silence would have. Jessica Okafor held up Margaret's flight bag, dumping its contents onto a metal table with theatrical disdain. Out tumbled the expected detritus of an elderly pilot, outdated charts, a half-eaten granola bar, reading glasses held together with tape, and a logbook so old its leather cover had worn smooth. "Look at this," Okafor announced, holding up the logbook. "She's been flying since the 60s. Probably should have stopped in the 80s. She flipped through pages covered in neat handwriting, then paused, frowning. Some of the entries were in code, not the standard notation any pilot would recognize. Meanwhile, in a small office across the base, data analyst Patricia Yamamoto was running Margaret's information through the system. The initial results were exactly what everyone expected: a retired teacher from Colorado Springs, widowed, living on Social Security, clean record, no outstanding warrants, no red flags. But something nagged at Patricia. The records were too clean, too perfect. She dug deeper, accessing databases most analysts ignored, and found something that made her blood run cold. There was a gap. From 1971 to 1987, Margaret Whitmore effectively didn't exist in any civilian system. No tax records, no addresses, no employment history, just a void where 16 years of a life should have been. Patricia's hands trembled as she accessed the classified databases she wasn't supposed to touch without authorization. What she found there made her push back from her desk so hard her chair hit the wall. In the control tower, Miguel Santos was having his own moment of terrible clarity. He'd pulled up archived approach patterns from the restricted database, the one that went back to the establishment of NORAD. His hands stilled on the keyboard as recognition dawned. The route the old woman had flown wasn't random. It was Sierra 77, a Cold War approach vector used by specially cleared aircraft carrying classified materials. An approach that had been discontinued in 1989 and supposedly known only to a handful of pilots, all of whom should have been dead or in nursing homes by now. But one was sitting in handcuffs in a processing hangar, blood still wet on her wrists. Back in the hangar, the live streams continued, views climbing as the story spread. Granny versus the government was trending, complete with unflattering screenshots of Margaret being manhandled by federal agents. Captain Jake Morrison gave an impromptu interview to a local news crew that had arrived for an unrelated story. "Just another day protecting America," he said with practiced humility that fooled no one. "You'd be surprised how many civilians think they can just fly wherever they want." Behind him, visible through the hangar's open door, Margaret sat perfectly, still on a metal bench, hands still cuffed, blood now dried on her wrists. She looked defeated, broken, exactly what everyone expected from a confused old woman who'd bitten off more than she could chew. It was then that Dmitry Volkov made his biggest mistake. Frustrated by Margaret's calm, annoyed by her refusal to beg or plead, he decided to escalate. Striding over to where she sat, he grabbed the photograph from her shirt pocket, the one she'd carefully removed from her aircraft. "What's this? Your accomplice?" He held it up mockingly, the image of the young girl visible to the cameras still, rolling. She must be so proud of Granny the terrorist. The word hung in the air like a slap. Several agents shifted uncomfortably. This was going too far, even for a show. Margaret's eyes, for the first time, showed emotion. Not fear, not anger, but something far more dangerous, pity. "Agent Volkov," she said, her voice carrying despite its softness, "you might want to make a phone call." He laughed, harsh and grating. "To who? Your lawyer? Your family? Nobody's coming to save you, old woman." She tilted her head slightly, the same gesture a predator might make when studying prey. "To your supervisor, tell him you have Phoenix 1 in custody. He'll know what it means." The words meant nothing to most of the room, but Patricia Yamamoto, still digging through classified databases, suddenly went pale. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing files that required 3 levels of authorization she technically didn't have. Phoenix Squadron, Cold War, female pilots, classified operations. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. She stood so quickly her chair toppled backward, racing for the processing area. At the same moment, Miguel Santos had reached the same conclusion through different means. The approach pattern, the precision, the calm under pressure. He grabbed the emergency phone, the one that connected directly to base command. "Sir, we have a situation. The airspace violator, I think she's one of the Phoenix pilots." The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds that felt like 5 years. Then, "Secure that hangar. No one in or out. I'm calling Washington." But it was too late to contain what had already been set in motion. The live streams, the social media posts, the mockery, it had all been part of the plan. Every humiliation, every cruel comment, every dismissive laugh had been carefully documented. In approximately 28 minutes, that documentation would become evidence of the most profound failure of judgment in the history of American military aviation. Margaret Whitmore looked up at Agent Volkov, who was still holding the photograph of her granddaughter, still smirking with the confidence of a man who believed power came from a badge and a gun. "The child in that picture," she said quietly, "is CIA. She's the one who discovered the chatter about sleeper agents being activated. She's also the one who suggested her grandmother might be the only person left alive who could retrieve the intelligence needed to stop them." Volkov's smirk faltered just slightly. "You see, Agent Volkov, you've been so busy humiliating a confused old woman that you never stopped to ask why a confused old woman would be flying a classified approach pattern that was discontinued before most of your agents were born." The hangar was getting quieter now, the earlier festive atmosphere cooling as people began to sense something was wrong. Margaret stood up slowly, the handcuffs still binding her hands behind her back, blood still staining her sweater. But somehow, despite everything they'd done to her, despite the mockery and the pain, she looked more dangerous now than she had sitting in the cockpit of her ancient Cessna. "The mission is complete," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hangar. "The package has been delivered. The threat has been neutralized. And every single one of you who found entertainment in an old woman's humiliation is about to learn what real power looks like." That's when the phones started ringing. All of them. Every federal agent's device buzzed simultaneously with the same message: "Operational security alert. Cease all recording immediately." "Wait further instructions." Brandon Kowalski's live stream cut to black mid-sentence. Jessica Okafor's phone powered down without warning. The news crew found their equipment mysteriously malfunctioning. Within 60 seconds, the hangar had gone from social media circus to communications blackout. Then came the sound of vehicles approaching, not the casual arrival of curious brass, but a convoy moving with purpose. Black SUVs with government plates, windows tinted past legal limits. They didn't park, they positioned, creating a perimeter that spoke of protection rather than containment. Margaret Whitmore smiled then, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd shown all day. "Gentlemen, ladies," she said to the suddenly nervous crowd, "I believe my ride is here." The lead vehicle's door opened before it had fully stopped, and out stepped Admiral Harrison Wright. His uniform bore ribbons most of the watching agents couldn't identify, but the authority in his bearing was unmistakable. His face was carved from granite and aged by worry, eyes scanning the hangar until they found Margaret. When their gazes met, the Admiral's shoulders sagged with what might have been relief or regret, or both. He walked past the assembled agents as if they were furniture, past Agent Volkov, who stood frozen with dawning horror, past the desk where Margaret's belongings lay scattered like accusations, past the crowd of officials who had spent the morning treating a national hero like a common criminal. He stopped 3 feet from where she sat, still cuffed, still bleeding, still maintaining that impossible dignity. Then, in a move that sent shockwaves through every witness, Admiral Harrison Wright snapped to attention and delivered a salute sharp enough to cut glass. "General Whitmore," his voice carried the weight of history, "I apologize for this inexcusable breach of security. You were cleared through the highest channels. This should never have happened." The hangar erupted in whispers, then fell silent, as the implications crashed over them like a cold wave. General. They'd cuffed a general. They'd mocked a general. They'd live-streamed the humiliation of a general. Colonel Elena Rodriguez emerged from the second vehicle, her presence commanding despite her modest height. She carried a sealed folder marked with classification stamps that seemed to glow with importance in the harsh fluorescent light. "Agent Dmitry Volkov," she announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "You are relieved of duty pending investigation. Agent Jessica Okafor, Agent Brandon Kowalski, surrender your credentials immediately." Her gaze swept the room like a scythe. "Every individual who participated in this travesty will be held accountable." But Margaret raised one shackled hand, a gesture that somehow commanded more authority than any shouted order. "Stand down, Colonel. They were doing their jobs." Admiral Wright moved quickly to remove the handcuffs, his own hands shaking slightly as he saw the damage they'd caused. "With respect, General, they exceeded their authority. The footage, the mockery." She stood slowly, dignity intact despite torn clothes and bloodied wrists. They did what they were trained to do when faced with an unknown threat. The failure was in the system, not the individuals. Captain Jake Morrison had gone pale beneath his tan, the cockiness drained away like water from a broken cup. "General, we didn't know." Margaret turned to him, and for a moment he saw what she must have been 40 years ago, the steel beneath the weathered exterior, the pilot who had flown missions that existed only in classified files. "Captain Morrison, you responded to a perceived threat with appropriate force. Your mistake was in letting contempt cloud your judgment. Never assume weakness because of age or gender. It's a lesson that might save your life someday." Lieutenant Ashley Cooper, who had stood silent through the revelation, finally found her voice. "Ma'am, we said things. You said what you thought. That's human nature." Margaret's tone was gentle now, almost grandmotherly. "But perhaps next time you'll remember that the person you're dealing with might have stories you can't imagine." Admiral Wright cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss the mission parameters in private, General." But Margaret shook her head. "No, they've earned the right to know what they were protecting." She looked around the hangar, meeting the eyes of those who had mocked her, those who had laughed, those who had treated her like a criminal. "In 1973, I was recruited into a program that officially never existed. Phoenix Squadron, 12 women trained to fly reconnaissance missions in aircraft modified to be invisible to radar through routes that threaded between detection gaps." The silence was absolute now. Even breathing seemed too loud. "We flew over places America couldn't officially go, gathered intelligence that couldn't officially exist. For 16 years, we flew missions that helped prevent 3 nuclear exchanges, exposed 2 attempted coups, and saved approximately 40,000 lives through early warning of military buildups." Agent Volkov, still holding the photograph he'd taken from her pocket, seemed to shrink with each word. "We were erased from history because our existence would have compromised ongoing operations. Our families were told we had died or disappeared. Our service records were sealed beyond even death." She paused, touching the scar on her hand. "This mark, shrapnel from a surface-to-air missile over a country I'm still not permitted to name. The only reason I survived was because I knew how to fly damaged aircraft through hostile airspace, skills that made your intercept today feel like a training exercise." Patricia Yamamoto had arrived during the revelation, her face pale with the weight of what she'd discovered in the classified databases. She held a printout in her trembling hands. Pages of redacted mission reports that painted a picture of heroism most people couldn't comprehend. "But why now?" Lieutenant Cooper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why come back?" Margaret smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd shown. "Because 40 years ago, we cached intelligence packages along our routes. Dead drops that could only be accessed by someone who knew the old patterns, who could fly them. By memory," she gestured to her flight bag, the one they'd so carelessly dumped out. One of those packages contained information about sleeper agents that were never activated, but whose descendants might be. "My granddaughter," she touched her pocket where the photo had been, "is CIA. She discovered chatter suggesting someone was trying to activate a cell we thought long dead." Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward. "The mission was classified ultra-black. Even mentioning its existence required presidential approval. General Whitmore volunteered to come out of retirement because she's the last surviving member of Phoenix. Squadron who can still fly." The weight of collective shame in the hangar was almost physical. Volkov had collapsed onto a bench, head in his hands. The other agents stood frozen, processing the magnitude of their error. "The irony," Margaret continued, her voice gentle now, "is that your intercept provided perfect cover. Any hostile intelligence watching would see exactly what you saw, a confused old woman who got lost. They'd never suspect that the real mission was completed during the chase." Captain Morrison found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Completed how? While you were focused on forcing me down, I was photographing updated positions of old dead drops, transmitting burst codes through frequencies you don't monitor. Mission accomplished, thanks to your unwitting assistance." Admiral Wright gestured toward the door. "Your aircraft has been refueled and cleared for immediate departure, General. The packages—" Margaret patted her flight bag. "Retrieved during pre-flight, hidden in the wheel well of the Cessna for 47 years, waiting for someone who knew where to look." She turned to leave, then paused. "Captain Morrison, Lieutenant Cooper, you're good pilots, but you're flying in a world that's all technology and no instinct. Learn to see beyond the obvious. The next Phoenix might not be as forgiving as I am." As she walked toward the door, every person in the hangar straightened to attention. Even the civilians, moved by something deeper than protocol, raised their hands in salute. The woman they'd dragged across concrete, whose blood still stained the handcuffs on Volkov's desk, walked past them with the bearing of someone who had earned every gray hair through service they could barely imagine. Patricia. Yamamoto clutched the classified printouts to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Miguel Santos stood at his control station, finally understanding why his father had kept certain stories locked away for so many years. And in that moment, every person who had laughed, who had mocked, who had found entertainment in an old woman's supposed confusion, understood that they had just witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had not just arrested a confused elderly pilot. They had arrested a legend. The silence that followed Margaret's departure was deafening. For several long moments, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The hangar felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of words that couldn't be taken back, and actions that couldn't be undone. Agent Dmitry Volkov was the first to break. Still holding Margaret's granddaughter's photograph, he stared at it with the horrified expression of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. His hands shook as the full weight of what he'd done crashed over him. He had called a decorated general, a woman who had risked her life for her country more times than he could count, a terrorist on camera, with the whole world watching. "I need to—" he started, then stopped, his voice breaking. "God, what have I done?" Colonel Rodriguez's expression was stone-cold professional, but her voice carried an undertone of barely controlled fury. "What you've done, Agent Volkov, is create an international incident. Every piece of footage from today will be classified and sealed, but the damage to our operational security is immeasurable." She turned to address the entire room. "As of this moment, everyone present is under direct orders from the Department of Defense. You will not discuss what happened here today. You will not post about it, tweet about it, or mention it to your spouse, your priest, or your therapist. Any violation will result in prosecution under the Espionage Act." Jessica Okafor, who had been composing social media posts about Granny's great adventure just hours earlier, felt sick to her stomach. "Colonel, we had no way of knowing—" "That's precisely the point, Agent Okafor. Your job was to assess and detain, not to humiliate and mock. You turned a classified operation into a circus for your own entertainment." Brandon Kowalski's phone buzzed with notifications, thousands of comments on his abruptly terminated live stream, people demanding to know what had happened, why the feed had cut out. He looked at the device like it was a venomous snake. "My stream. People saw everything up until the blackout. They're asking questions." "And they'll keep asking," Colonel Rodriguez replied grimly. "The official story is equipment malfunction during a routine training exercise. Anyone who suggests otherwise will find themselves explaining their theories to federal investigators." Captain Jake Morrison stood at attention, his face pale. The casual arrogance that had defined him just hours earlier was completely gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone confronting the worst mistake of their life. "Colonel, permission to speak?" "Granted. I need to know, how many others like her are there? How many times have we—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "General Whitmore is the last surviving member of Phoenix Squadron. The others died in service or passed away from natural causes, but there are other programs, Captain Morrison. Other heroes whose sacrifices remain classified. Today should teach you that the person you're dealing with might have done things for this country that you can't imagine." Lieutenant Ashley Cooper had been silent through most of the confrontation, but now she stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need to understand something. If the mission was so classified, why didn't we have any warning? Why weren't we briefed?" Admiral Wright, who had remained to oversee the damage control, answered her. "Because the mission's success depended on authentic reactions. If you had known who General Whitmore was, you would have treated her differently. The enemy surveillance we suspected would have noticed that difference." "Enemy surveillance?" Morrison's voice cracked slightly. 3 individuals with ties to the sleeper cell were arrested this morning based on intelligence General Whitmore retrieved. They had been monitoring our communications, watching for any sign that we were onto them. Your routine intercept of a confused civilian provided perfect cover for the real operation. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Their humiliation of Margaret hadn't just been cruel, it had been strategically necessary. They had unknowingly played their parts in a counterintelligence operation that had prevented a potential terrorist attack. Patricia Yamamoto raised a trembling hand. "Sir, I've been going through the classified files. The Phoenix Squadron, some of their missions are still classified above your clearance level, Analyst Yamamoto. But I will say this. The woman you watched being dragged across that tarmac has more confirmed kills than most fighter pilots, has prevented more catastrophes than most people experience, and has sacrificed more for this country than any of us will ever know." Miguel Santos finally spoke up from his position near the door. "My father used to tell stories, aircraft that didn't exist, pilots who weren't there." "I thought they were just war stories." "Your father was a smart man, Controller Santos. He kept secrets that needed to be kept. Today, you all learned why those secrets matter." Agent Volkov finally looked up from the photograph. "What happens to us now?" Colonel Rodriguez's expression didn't soften. "That depends on your actions going forward. General Whitmore requested that no formal charges be filed, but your careers in federal law enforcement are effectively over. The TSA agents will be transferred to desk positions. The pilots will face review boards. And me?" Volkov's voice was barely a whisper. "You assaulted a general officer during a classified operation, Agent Volkov. You're fortunate that General Whitmore is recommending clemency, or you'd be facing court-martial and federal prison." The weight of Margaret's mercy hit him like a sledgehammer. Even after everything they'd done to her, she was protecting them from the full consequences of their actions. Outside, they could hear the sound of Margaret's ancient Cessna starting up again. The engine cough and rumble seemed impossibly loud in the context of everything they now knew about its pilot. "She's leaving?" Lieutenant Cooper asked. "Her mission is complete," Admiral Wright replied. "General Whitmore has served her country one last time. She's earned her retirement." As the sound of the departing aircraft faded into the distance, the assembled group stood in the wreckage of their assumptions. The phones that had captured Margaret's humiliation now felt like evidence of their own shame. The jokes they'd made echoed in their minds like accusations. Brandon Kowalski was the first to speak what everyone was thinking. "We're never going to live this down, are we?" "No," Colonel Rodriguez said simply. "You're not. But perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps remembering this day will make you better officers, better agents, better people." She gathered her files and prepared to leave. "The debriefing will continue tomorrow at 800. Until then, I suggest you all spend some time thinking about the difference between what someone appears to be and what they actually are." As the hangar emptied, each person carried with them the weight of a lesson learned too late. They had met a hero and mistaken her for a victim. They had encountered greatness and responded with contempt. In 3 hours, Margaret Whitmore would be sitting in her favorite diner, ordering eggs over easy and reading the newspaper like any other retiree. But the people she left behind would be forever changed by the knowledge that they had been part of something historic, not as heroes, but as the cautionary tale. The Phoenix had risen one last time, completed one final mission, and shown them all what real strength looked like, and they would never forget it. 3 days later, the consequences were still unfolding like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Agent Dmitry Volkov sat in his sparse apartment, staring at a termination letter that had arrived via courier that morning. Effective immediately and without prejudice were small consolations for a career that had ended in spectacular failure. He'd spent the last 72 hours replaying every moment, every cruel word, every unnecessary shove. The photograph of Margaret's granddaughter sat on his coffee table, returned to him along with his personal effects when he cleaned out his desk. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away, couldn't stop looking at the bright eyes of the little girl whose grandmother he'd called a terrorist on live television. His phone buzzed with another message from a reporter trying to get his side of the Peterson incident, as the media had dubbed it. The official story was holding equipment malfunction during routine training, but rumors were spreading. Someone had leaked portions of Brandon Kowalski's terminated stream, and internet detectives were having a field day trying to piece together what had really happened. Volkov deleted the message without reading it, just like he'd deleted the previous 47. Across town, Captain Jake Morrison was having his own reckoning. He sat in his base quarters, still in uniform, but already knowing it might be for the last time. The review board would convene tomorrow, and while Colonel Rodriguez had indicated that criminal charges were unlikely, his career as a fighter pilot was almost certainly over. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his father's number, a retired Air Force colonel who had served during the tail end of the Cold War. "Jake, I heard about what happened." "Dad, I can't really talk about it. It's classified." "I know what classified means, son. I also know what shame sounds like in a man's voice. You want to tell me about it?" For the next hour, Jake found himself explaining everything. The intercept, the mockery, the revelation, the aftermath. His father listened without interruption, the silence on the other end growing heavier with each detail. "Jesus, Jake," his father finally said. "Phoenix Squadron. I heard whispers about them back in the day. Stories that were more legend than fact. You kids today, you think the Cold War was just old men playing politics. You have no idea how close we came to losing everything. How many times?" "Dad, You humiliated a hero, son. A real one. The kind they don't make anymore because they don't have to. Because people like her did the impossible so your generation could have the luxury of not believing in it." The line went quiet for a long moment. "What do I do now?" Jake asked. "You learn. You remember, and you spend the rest of your life making sure it never happens again." At Peterson Air Force Base, the ripple effects continued to spread. Miguel Santos had been promoted to head controller. His quick thinking in recognizing the Phoenix approach pattern had earned him commendation rather than reprimand. But the promotion felt hollow, weighted with the knowledge of what might have happened if he'd been just a few minutes slower to act. He stood in the control tower, looking out at the runway where Margaret had landed her ancient Cessna. A maintenance crew was still cleaning scuff marks from the concrete, evidence of the undignified way she'd been forced to the ground. His replacement shift arrived early, as they had every day since the incident. Word had spread through the controller community about what had happened, and everyone wanted to hear the story firsthand. Miguel had stopped telling it after the second day. Some stories he'd learned were too heavy to share casually. Patricia Yamamoto had been transferred to a different facility entirely. Her unauthorized access to classified databases had been overlooked given the circumstances, but her superiors wanted her away from Peterson until the heat died down. She'd spent her last day there printing out every declassified document she could find about female military pilots, planning to donate them to the Women in Military Service Museum. It wasn't much, but it was something. A way to honor the women whose stories had been buried in classification stamps and official denials. At a small diner in Colorado Springs, Margaret Whitmore sat in her usual booth, reading the morning paper over coffee and eggs. The newspaper's front page carried a brief mention of technical difficulties during routine training exercises at Peterson, but Margaret barely glanced at it. She was more interested in a small item buried on page 6. 3 arrested in terror. Plot. The article was brief, mentioning only that federal agents had disrupted a potential domestic terrorism cell based on recently developed intelligence. No mention of 40-year-old dead drops or elderly pilots flying classified routes. Perfect. Her granddaughter called as she was finishing breakfast. "Grandma, I saw the news about Peterson. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just a little turbulence, nothing I couldn't handle." "The package?" Margaret smiled, touching the small device in her pocket, a data storage unit no bigger than a thumbnail, containing intelligence that had helped neutralize a threat most people would never know existed. "Delivered safely. Your people should have everything they need now." "I'm proud of you, Grandma. I know it wasn't easy, coming out of retirement." "It was necessary. Besides, it felt good to fly the old routes one more time. Reminded me why we did what we did." After the call ended, Margaret sat quietly for a moment, watching the morning traffic through the diner window. Ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, protected by sacrifices they'd never know about, by heroes they'd never meet. That's how it should be, she thought. Heroes shouldn't need recognition. They just needed to know the job was done. The waitress, a young woman named Amy, who had been serving Margaret for 3 years, approached with the check. "Says, everything all right today, Mrs. Whitmore? You seem, I don't know, different somehow." Margaret looked up at her. Really looked. Amy was about the same age Margaret had been when she first put on a flight suit and disappeared into a world that officially didn't exist. Young, capable, probably stronger than she knew. "Everything's exactly as it should be, dear," Margaret said, leaving a generous tip. "Sometimes the world needs people to do difficult things quietly. Most folks never see it happening, and that's okay. That's how it's supposed to work." Amy nodded, not quite understanding, but sensing the weight behind the words. As Margaret walked to her car, she passed a newsstand where Brandon Kowalski's former live stream was being discussed on a morning talk show playing on a small television. The hosts were speculating wildly about what had really happened. Why? The stream had been cut, whether there was a cover-up. If they only knew, Margaret thought with amusement, if they only knew that the real story was simultaneously more boring and more extraordinary than anything they could imagine. An old woman had taken a routine flight, completed a routine mission, and gone home to her routine life. The fact that the mission had involved preventing a terrorist attack and the woman was a legend from America's most classified program was beside the point. Back at Peterson, the cleanup continued. The hangar where Margaret had been processed was being scrubbed and repainted, not because of any contamination, but because too many people associated it with shame now. Colonel Rodriguez had ordered the work as much for morale as for practicality. Agent Jessica Okafor was packing up her desk when she found the photo she'd taken of Margaret's scattered belongings. In the picture, the old woman's flight bag lay empty on the metal table, its contents spread out like accusations, outdated charts, reading glasses, a granola bar, the leather logbook with its mysterious coded entries. Looking at it now, knowing what she knew, Jessica could see what she'd missed before. The charts weren't randomly outdated, they were specific additions from specific years, carefully preserved. The logbook's code wasn't confusion, it was operational security. Even the granola bar had meaning. It was a specific brand, popular. Among military pilots decades ago, every detail had been a clue, and they'd missed them all because they'd seen what they expected to see, a confused old woman instead of a master spy. Jessica deleted the photo and closed her desk drawer for the last time. The story was spreading through unofficial channels now, whispered conversations in pilot lounges, coded discussions in intelligence circles, carefully worded emails between people who understood the importance of discretion. Within a year, it would become legend. Within a decade, it would be the kind of story old-timers told to warn young officers about the dangers of assumptions. But Margaret Whitmore wouldn't be around to see her legend grow. She had more immediate concerns, like deciding whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in her garden this year, and whether to finally fix that loose step on her front porch. The Phoenix had returned to the ashes of anonymity, where it belonged. The mission was complete. 6 months later, the consequences had crystallized into permanent changes that rippled through multiple agencies. Agent Dmitry Volkov found himself working security at a small regional airport in Alaska, about as far from classified operations as the federal government could send him. The job was mind-numbing, checking IDs, scanning bags, dealing with the occasional drunk passenger, but every time he saw an elderly traveler, he found himself being extra courteous, extra careful, extra respectful. His supervisor, a gruff former Marine named Tommy Rodriguez, had noticed the change. "You're different from most of the transfers we get," Tommy observed during a coffee break. "Usually guys sent here are bitter, angry. You just seem careful." Volkov nodded, watching an elderly woman navigate the security checkpoint with her walker. "I learned something about assumptions, about how wrong you can be when you think you know someone just by looking at them." He never told Tommy the full story, but he carried Margaret's lesson with him every day. The photograph of her granddaughter had gone into a frame on his desk at home, not as a trophy but as a reminder, a daily penance for the worst mistake of his professional life. Captain Jake Morrison had resigned his commission, as everyone expected, but his next career choice surprised many who knew him. He'd enrolled in flight instructor school and was now teaching student pilots at a civilian aviation academy in Texas. His students found him demanding but fair, with an unusual emphasis on humility and respect. He had a habit of telling them, "Never assume you're the best pilot in the sky. The best pilot might be flying something that looks like junk, might be old enough to be your grandmother, and might have stories that would make your head spin." Xiao. When pressed for details about this philosophy, he would simply say, "I learned it the hard way. Trust me, you don't want to learn it the same way I did." One of his students, a cocky young man named Travis, who reminded Jake of his former self, had challenged this advice. "Come on, Instructor Morrison, what's some old lady in a Cessna going to teach me about flying?" Jake had gone very quiet for a moment, then said, "Son, the most dangerous words in aviation are just an old lady, or just a training aircraft, or just a routine flight. The moment you say just about anything in the sky, you've stopped learning, and the moment you stop learning, you start dying." Travis never challenged Jake's philosophy again. Lieutenant Ashley Cooper had stayed in the Air Force but requested transfer to transport duties. She now flew cargo planes, less glamorous, than fighters, but the work felt more meaningful. She'd volunteered for every mission supporting humanitarian efforts, disaster relief, and medical evacuations. Her fellow pilots noticed she had an unusual habit of learning the names and backgrounds of ground crew, maintenance personnel, and passengers. She'd been heard saying, "Everyone has a story. Everyone deserves respect. You never know who you're really talking to." When a reporter had tried to interview her about the Peterson incident for a piece on military transparency, Ashley had declined comment but offered a statement. "I learned that day that heroism doesn't look like what you expect. Sometimes it looks like weakness or confusion or ordinariness. Real heroes don't announce themselves. They just do what needs to be done." The reporter had pressed for more details, but Ashley had simply added, "I hope I never forget that lesson. I hope none of us do." At Peterson Air Force Base, the changes were institutional. Colonel Rodriguez had implemented new protocols for intercept operations, including mandatory cultural sensitivity training and historical awareness courses. Every pilot now learned about classified programs from past eras, about the possibility that civilian aircraft might be involved in operations they weren't cleared to know about. The training included a case study simply called the Phoenix Incident, heavily redacted but detailed enough to drive home the point that appearances could be fatally deceptive. Miguel Santos had used his promotion to implement changes in air traffic control procedures as well. Controllers now had access to a new database that could flag aircraft potentially involved in classified operations without revealing operational details. The system was informally known as Phoenix Protocol. Patricia Yamamoto had become something of a legend in intelligence analysis circles. Her quick thinking in uncovering Margaret's real identity had been cited in training manuals as an example of thorough investigation technique. She'd been promoted and now ran training programs for new analysts. Her favorite lecture was titled The Danger of Clean Records. She would tell her students, sometimes the most important thing about a person's file is what's not in it. Gaps in records don't always mean poor documentation. Sometimes they mean someone was doing something so classified that even their existence was classified. The TSA agents who had participated in Margaret's humiliation faced various consequences. Jessica Okafor had been transferred to a position processing paperwork in a windowless office in Detroit. Brandon Kowalski had lost his security clearance entirely and now worked at a private security company, checking bags at shopping malls. But both had taken their experiences to heart. Jessica had enrolled in night school, studying history and focusing on intelligence operations during the Cold War. Brandon had started volunteering at a veterans hospital, spending time with elderly vets whose stories reminded him that heroism often wore the most unlikely faces. At the small diner in Colorado Springs where Margaret had her regular breakfast, the waitress Amy had framed a newspaper clipping about the Peterson incident, the sanitized version that mentioned only technical difficulties during routine training. She'd written below it, "You never know who you're serving coffee to." Her manager had asked about it once, and Amy had replied, "I had a customer teach me that everyone has a story. Everyone deserves respect. You never know when you're talking to someone who changed the world." The intelligence that Margaret had retrieved during her final mission had indeed proven crucial. The terrorist cell that had been planning to activate dormant assets was completely dismantled. 3 major attacks were prevented, including one targeting a children's hospital and another aimed at a military base. The operation's success had led to broader investigations that uncovered 2 other related cells, ultimately saving an estimated 800 lives. None of this made it into any public reports, but within the intelligence community, Operation Phoenix Rising was studied as a masterclass in using historical assets for modern operations. Margaret's granddaughter, CIA agent Sarah Whitmore, had been promoted and now ran a special task force dedicated to investigating threats from historical intelligence operations. She kept her grandmother's photograph on her desk, the same one that had been taken from Margaret's pocket during her arrest. When colleagues asked about it, Sarah would say, "She reminds me that the best operations are the ones nobody ever hears about, and the best operatives are the ones nobody suspects." The classified world had learned its lesson. Never underestimate the elderly woman in the old airplane. But Margaret Whitmore remained blissfully unaware of her growing legend. She had more important things to worry about, like whether the grocery store still carried her favorite brand of tea and when her neighbor's grandson would be home from his deployment so she could bake him his favorite cookies. The Phoenix had taught the world one final lesson, delivered one last blow for justice, and then disappeared back into the comfortable anonymity of retirement. But those who had been touched by her story would carry its lessons for the rest of their lives. Respect costs nothing, assumptions can be deadly, and heroes often look nothing like what you expect. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone overlooks. Sometimes justice comes not with fanfare, but with quiet dignity and the patient accumulation of consequences. And sometimes the greatest victory is the one where nobody knows you won. 2 years after the Peterson incident, Margaret Whitmore sat in her garden on a warm spring morning, reading a letter that had arrived with no return address. The envelope bore only her name in careful script, and inside was a single sheet of government stationery with a presidential seal. Mrs. Whitmore, on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for your continued service. The mission's success prevented immeasurable tragedy. Your sacrifice and that of your Phoenix Squadron sisters will not be forgotten by those who matter. Sleep. Well, knowing the watch continues. It was unsigned, but Margaret recognized the handwriting. She'd briefed enough presidents during her active years to know the distinctive penmanship of the Oval Office. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box with her other mementos, the few things she'd been allowed to keep from her years in the shadows. A challenge coin from a mission that never happened. A photograph of 12 women standing beside aircraft that officially didn't exist. A small piece of shrapnel from a missile that had nearly ended her story decades ago. The box went back into its hiding place, and Margaret returned to her morning routine: coffee, newspaper, and the satisfaction of a life well lived. She had no idea that her story was still spreading. In pilot lounges across the country, instructors told careful versions of her tale to cocky students who needed humbling. In intelligence training centers, analysts studied redacted reports of her final mission. In military academies, cadets learned about the importance of respect and the danger of assumptions. The story had become a modern legend, with Margaret as its unlikely hero, though she would have laughed at such a description. She'd simply done her job, just as she'd always done. At Peterson Air Force Base, a small memorial had been quietly installed near the control tower. To most visitors, it appeared to be a simple garden with a bronze plaque honoring those who served in silence. Casta. But those who knew the real story understood its deeper meaning. Miguel Santos, now the chief controller, made sure fresh flowers were always in the garden. He'd never forgotten the day an elderly woman in an ancient airplane had taught an entire airbase about heroism. Jake Morrison's flight school had become known for producing pilots with unusual levels of humility and respect. His students carried his lessons into the commercial airlines, the military, and civilian aviation, spreading the principle that had cost him his career to learn: never underestimate anyone. Ashley Cooper had risen through the ranks to become a squadron commander. She was known for her inclusive leadership style and her insistence that every member of her team, from pilots to mechanics to administrative staff, be treated with equal respect. Her squadrons consistently outperformed others, not through superior skill, but through superior teamwork built on mutual respect. The TSA had quietly implemented new training protocols based on the Peterson incident, while the details remained. Classified, the core message was clear: treat every traveler with dignity because you never know who you're dealing with. Agent Volkov had found peace in his Alaskan exile. The isolation and routine work had given him time to reflect on the kind of man he wanted to be. He'd started volunteering at a local veterans center where elderly former servicemen and women shared stories of their experiences. He listened to each one with the attention he should have given Margaret, learning from their wisdom and honoring their service in small, personal ways. Patricia Yamamoto had become the government's leading expert on historical intelligence operations. Her work had uncovered dozens of forgotten heroes whose stories deserved to be told, even if only within classified circles. She'd established a quiet tradition of ensuring that every declassified hero received proper recognition, even decades after their service. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture itself. The Peterson incident had become a touchstone, a reminder that heroism came in many forms, and that respect was not just courtesy, it was operational security. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 years after her final mission, Margaret Whitmore didn't wake up. She was found peacefully in her bed, the newspaper still folded on her nightstand, a cup of cold coffee waiting to be finished. The neighbors said she looked content, as if she'd simply decided it was time to rest. The funeral was small, as she would have wanted. A handful of neighbors, some fellow teachers from her cover career, and a few mysterious visitors in dark suits who signed the guest book with names that wouldn't check out if anyone looked. Admiral Wright delivered a brief eulogy that spoke of a life of quiet service and extraordinary sacrifice. He didn't mention Phoenix Squadron or classified missions, or the fact that the woman they were burying had saved more lives than most people would ever know. He simply said she had been a true patriot who asked for nothing and gave everything. As the service ended, 12 F-16s flew overhead in missing man formation, a final salute to the last Phoenix. The official explanation was a routine training exercise, but those who knew better understood the deeper meaning. Margaret's granddaughter Sarah inherited her modest house and found, hidden behind a false wall in the basement, a complete archive of Phoenix Squadron documents. Photographs, mission reports, commendations that had never been officially awarded, the complete record of one of America's most classified programs. Working with historians and declassification experts, Sarah began the long process of ensuring that her grandmother's story and the stories of her 11 Phoenix sisters would eventually be told. Not today, perhaps not for decades, but someday. The archive also contained one final surprise, a video recording Margaret had made shortly after the Peterson incident. In it, she sat in her kitchen, looking directly into the camera with those same steady eyes that had faced down SAM missiles and hostile aircraft and contemptuous federal agents. "If you're watching this," she said, "then I'm gone, and Sarah has found what I wanted her to find." The story of Phoenix Squadron deserves to be told, not for glory, but so future generations understand what real service looks like. We were 12 women who chose to disappear from history so our country could be safer. We flew missions that officially never happened, prevented wars that were never declared, and saved lives that were never counted. But the most important thing I want people to understand is this: heroism isn't about recognition. It's about doing what's right when no one is watching, when no one will ever know, when the only reward is the knowledge that you've made a difference. The people at Peterson that day, they learned something important. They learned that strength doesn't always announce itself, that courage doesn't always wear a uniform, and that the person you're dismissing might be the very person who saved your life without you ever knowing it. I hope they remember that lesson. I hope they teach it to others. Because the world needs people who understand that real power moves quietly, real heroism works in shadows, and real justice doesn't need an audience. The phoenix burns bright, dies in ashes, and is reborn. We were the phoenix. Our mission is complete. But the idea, the principle, that must continue. In every young pilot who chooses humility over arrogance, in every agent who chooses respect over contempt, in every person who looks beyond appearances to see the human being beneath. That's how Phoenix rises again, not in flame and spectacle, but in the quiet choices of good people doing right things. Take care of each other. Question your assumptions. Treat everyone with dignity. And remember, you never know who you're really talking to. The video ended with Margaret raising a cup of coffee in a small salute, that same slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Sarah watched the recording 3 times before calling. Admiral Wright, within a week, selected portions had been incorporated into training programs across multiple agencies. The full video would remain classified for decades, but its message began spreading immediately. At Peterson Air Force Base, a new tradition began. Every year on the anniversary of the Phoenix incident, all personnel gathered for what was officially called professional development training, but was really a reminder of the lessons learned that day. The session always began with the same story, an elderly woman in an old airplane who taught an entire airbase about respect, assumptions, and the true nature of heroism. Jake Morrison, now a chief instructor, was often invited to speak at these sessions. He would tell his part of the story with unflinching honesty, describing his arrogance, his mockery, his complete failure to recognize greatness when it was right in front of him. "I learned that day," he would conclude, "that the uniform doesn't make the hero, the aircraft doesn't make the pilot, and the appearance doesn't reveal the person. Character does, service does, sacrifice does, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones you'll never suspect, never recognize, and never thank." And the audience always listened in absolute silence. 10 years after Margaret's death, a small ceremony was held at the Air Force Museum. A new exhibit was unveiled, Hidden Heroes Classified Service in Defense of Freedom. It featured no names, no specific operations, no classified details, just the acknowledgement that countless Americans had served their country in ways that would never be publicly recognized. In the center of the exhibit stood a simple display case containing a faded flight suit, a worn leather logbook, and a photograph of 12 women standing beside aircraft that looked impossibly primitive by modern standards. The placard read, Phoenix Squadron. 12 women who flew missions that officially never happened, in aircraft that officially didn't exist, to places that officially weren't there. Their service prevented 3 nuclear exchanges, stopped 2 attempted coups, and saved approximately 40,000 lives. They asked for no recognition and received none. They served in perfect silence and disappeared into perfect anonymity. This is their only memorial. Below that, in smaller text, character is what you do when no one is watching. Heroism is what you do when no one will ever know. Service is what you do when no one will ever thank you. Visitors to the exhibit often stood in long, contemplative silence. Parents pointed it out to their children. Veterans saluted quietly. Young pilots stared at the display with new understanding of what service really meant. And sometimes, just sometimes, an elderly woman or man would approach the case, look at the photograph of the 12 Phoenix pilots, and smile with the recognition of someone who knew that heroes come in all forms, serve in all ways, and that the greatest victories are often the ones nobody knows about. Margaret Whitmore had wanted to be forgotten, to fade back into anonymity after her final mission. In that, she had failed completely. She had become legend. Not the kind of legend celebrated in movies or books, but the kind whispered in training. Halls and remembered in quiet moments when someone needed to remember what real heroism looked like. The Phoenix had indeed risen one last time, not as a single woman completing a single mission, but as an idea that would inspire countless others. To serve with humility, respect, and quiet dignity. In the end, that was her greatest victory. Not the terrorists stopped or the attacks prevented, but the lesson learned and passed down, that heroes walk among us every day, looking nothing like what we expect, asking for nothing we think they deserve, and changing the world in ways we'll never know. The Phoenix burns bright, dies in ashes, and is reborn. Forever and always, the Phoenix rises. Some stories end with explosions and acclaim. The best ones end with a quiet woman drinking coffee, having saved the world without anyone noticing. That's the thing about real heroes. They don't need you to know who they are. They just need to know the job is done. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever encountered someone who completely surprised you with their hidden background or abilities? Share your story in the comments. You might inspire our next video. Thanks for joining us today, and remember, never judge a book by its cover. You never know when you might be talking to a hero. Until next time, keep believing in the extraordinary people all around us.